The crisp, clear sound of a pilot tearing apart a young black woman's ID echoed, breaking the silence in the first-class cabin abruptly. The only response was a collective gasp. The man doing this was a pilot with graying hair and medals pinned to his chest, symbolizing both his experience and age in the profession. Looking at the woman with a smirk, he said, "Enjoy your flight." He had mistaken her silence for weakness, her youth for inexperience, but he was wrong. His actions opened a Pandora's box for his career. This isn't just a story about a confrontation at censorling feet. It's the real-life account of how a decorated captain's high-flying career came crashing down, all because he chose to abuse his power against the one woman he should have feared most. Have you ever wondered why some people think they can step on others? Just because of the color of their skin or the sound of their name? Imagine this, you're sitting there in a cramped cabin, right, just trying to get to where you're going. The noise around you slowly fades, the hum of the engines turning into a soft whisper, "Eh?" And all you want is peace. But life doesn't work that way, and sometimes in the most unexpected places, people reveal who they truly are. Dr. Amara Carter sat in seat RB on flight Chibite-Isherwu, her back pressed against the luxurious leather of the first-class seat. This was supposed to be a moment of calm, a brief respite from the relentless grind of her work. The week had been long, filled with covert operations and close calls. But here, she thought, she could breathe. She could slip into her mind, maybe read a bit from Marcus Aurelius, as she always did when she had a moment to herself. But the world has a way of reaching into your space when you least expect it. She felt something just from the corner of her eye, a presence. It wasn't the polite, gentle attention of the flight attendants or the quiet murmurs of other passengers. No, this was different. It was Captain Richard Callahan walking down the aisle, his hands resting too comfortably on the back of each seat. His step had a puffed-up look, as if he owned every inch of the plane, like it all belonged to him. His uniform was sharp, the medals gleaming, each one a symbol of his years of service. He had a particular look in his eyes, the kind that quickly assessed and dismissed, as if the world were in its place and he was at the top. And when he passed her, his eyes flicked just once, too brief, too judgmental, to linger on her a moment longer than necessary. Amara didn't flinch. She had seen that look before, from many people, in different parts of her life. The kind of look that said she didn't belong in places like this, places of power, privilege, and prestige. It wasn't the kind of gaze you could pin down with logic or reason. It wasn't about her resume or her accomplishments. It was about the way she looked, the way the world assumed a young black woman in first class must have slipped through the cracks. But Amara had learned something important during her years of training, something deeper than intelligence or authority. She had learned that people like Captain Callahan couldn't see what they were too afraid to understand. She wasn't here to prove anything to him. But something in her felt the weight of his judgment, and she couldn't help but feel her chest tighten. Not because of his gaze, but because of the very nature of his assumptions. They were old, worn-out beliefs that had nothing to do with her, but had everything to do with him. He greeted the other passengers with forced cheer, his smile fake but practiced. He was a man used to power, used to the routine of giving orders and making judgments. But when he approached Amara, his greeting faltered. It was subtle at first, a hesitation in his step. His eyes, for the briefest of moments, scanned her up and down, a flash of something in his mind, a calculation, an evaluation. But there was no greeting, no smile. His face shifted ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if to ask the question, "Sariand, What is she doing here? She didn't respond to the silent query. Instead, she pulled out her book, pretending to focus on the ink. Her mind had already moved to London, to the meeting with M.I. Wu. That awaited her. She wasn't here to fight, to deal with this. She was here on a mission. But the silence didn't last long. Captain Callahan reappeared from the cockpit, his tall frame cutting through the aisle, his boots heavy on the polished floor. He stopped by Amara's seat, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in that voice, deep, smooth, but carrying an edge. "I'm going to need to verify your boarding pass." Amara blinked once, slowly, closing her book as if the exchange were beneath her notice. She wasn't angry. No, that wasn't the right word. She was irritated, yes, but not angry. She simply didn't have the energy for his kind of idiocy. She reached into her bag and pulled out her boarding pass, handing it to him. "Here you go," she said, her voice level and calm. Callahan didn't take the boarding pass immediately. His fingers brushed the edge of it, a deliberate pause. His gaze lifted from the pass to her face, as if seeking something, some clue, some reason why she wasn't who he assumed her to be. He read her name aloud, as if doing so would clarify some mystery in his mind. Dr. Amara Carter. He looked at the name as if it were a question. What kind of doctor are you? The question hung in the air like an insult. Now, though he meant it casually, even condescendingly, Amara felt her patience thinning, the need to correct him rising like a wave. But instead of letting it rise, she swallowed it down. "The kind that enjoys her privacy," she said, with a politeness that was as sharp as any reprimand. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he squinted at her, assessing her, wondering how someone like her could have made it to a place like this. "I've had some issues lately," he said, his tone hardening. "People trying to get into premium cabins where they don't belong." He let the words hang there, heavy with implication. Amara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Her training kicked in, the voice in her mind reminding her, stay calm, stay in control. This was a moment to observe, to make an assessment of her own. What he was doing wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about security. It was about power. And it was about his need to feel it, to wield it over her. She knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't even a slip of the tongue. "It was deliberate, I assure you, Captain," she said, her voice dangerously quiet now. "I belong here." His eyes narrowed at her, still skeptical, still dismissive. He didn't return her boarding pass right away. He turned it over, scanning the details once more. "Rope?" And then, without breaking his gaze, he handed it back to her. But he didn't let go. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, with a mocking undertone, "but I'll need to see a form of ID to match this boarding pass." It was at that moment that the atmosphere shifted in the cabin. The tension that had been simmering suddenly boiled over. The other passengers, their conversations pausing, their eyes glancing over the tops of their newspapers, could feel it. They could sense that something wasn't right, and that something was this man standing in front of Amara, his fingers clutching her boarding pass like it was a weapon. Amara took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the cold steel of her Glock in her bag. She hadn't wanted to do this, but the choice had been made for her. She reached into her bag once more, but this time it wasn't just her boarding pass she retrieved. It was her wallet. She pulled out her ID, her real ID, and handed it to him. "Here," she said softly, her hand steady. "Now, if you're satisfied." Callahan glanced at the license, inspecting it carefully. It was a routine action, something he did hundreds of times, or so he thought. But when he saw the name, when he saw her face on the ID, something shifted. It wasn't the security breach he'd been expecting, no. It was something far more dangerous. It was the first crack in his certainty, and he didn't see it coming. The moment seemed to stretch, go like the silent pause before a storm. Callahan didn't hand the ID back. Instead, he squinted at it again, turning it over in his hands like it might reveal some hidden secret. His eyes darted from the photo to her face and back again. The flicker of realization didn't quite hit him yet, but it was coming, slowly. Amara watched him, her gaze steady. She didn't move. She had seen this before, the slow turn of disbelief, the confusion, the realization. But there was something else now, something deeper in Callahan's eyes that she hadn't expected. Uncertainty. For a moment he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to process what he was seeing. And she could feel it like a tightening in the air between them. He looked at her again, and this time it wasn't just a glance. It was a deeper scan, as though trying to confirm if the world he thought he understood was, in fact, real. "This is a good picture," he said after a long moment, his voice strangely low, as if trying to convince himself. "Professional, it's a driver's license, Captain," Amara replied flatly. Her patience, which had been razor-thin to begin with, was wearing dangerously thin. She could hear the words in her mind, repeating like a mantra. Ridot. Do not react. Do not escalate. Keep your cool. Stay in control. Callahan wasn't listening. Instead, he twisted the ID between his fingers, pressing it against the light, scrutinizing it as if it were a counterfeit. "You know, these things can be faked. A pretty girl like you. You'd be surprised what people will do for a little bit of luxury they haven't earned," he muttered, his words slipping into an undertone of sneering disdain. The insult cut deeper than it should have. But Amara didn't react. She could feel the fire rising inside her, but she suppressed it. She had worked too hard, fought too long to let someone like him strip away her dignity with a few choice words. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, just enough to make him meet her gaze. "I belong here," she said again, her voice measured but firm. "Return my identification to me now." For a second, the tension in the cabin escalated, the quiet buzz of the passengers fading into a backdrop of sharp focus. The other passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. Eyes flickered over the top of newspapers, from smartphones, from the smooth leather of seatbacks. No one wanted to be caught staring, but they couldn't look away. Callahan, caught in his own tangled sense of superiority, smirked. "Oh, I'm sure you do," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't take his eyes off her. "But for the airline's security, I'm going to need to see more than just this," he said, bending her driver's license between his thumb and forefinger with deliberate force. His intent was clear. He wanted to break her spirit, make her small, make her less. But Amara wasn't like the others. She wasn't a woman you could push around, no matter how much you wore the mask of authority. She wasn't a woman you could break with words, even cruel ones. Her hand shot out with such precision, such confidence, that for a moment it felt like the entire cabin held its breath. She snatched the ID from his hand, her fingers curling tightly around it. Not out of anger, but out of a profound sense of control. "Stop," she ordered, her voice quiet but powerful. Callahan's eyes widened just a fraction. It was only a brief shift in his gaze, but Amara felt it. He had thought he was the one controlling this moment, but now he was the one caught in the web. His ego, bloated and fragile, was slowly being chipped away with every word she spoke. The flight attendant, Chloe, had been standing nearby, a hesitant observer to the exchange. Her eyes were wide, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if bracing herself for the fallout. But the confrontation didn't come. She didn't step forward, she didn't interrupt. Chloe was merely watching, frozen by the scene unfolding before her. It was as if a storm had passed over her, and she hadn't even realized it until the calm returned. But there was no calm for Callahan. His face flushed, turning redder with every passing second. His grip on his own sense of power was slipping away, his actions only reinforcing his guilt. He sneered once more, taking the license from Amara's hand with a flick of his fingers, as though dismissing her "This ID is flimsy," he muttered under his breath, squeezing it again, bending it just to see if it would crack. He was playing a dangerous game now. Not only was he trying to break her, he was trying to make her appear ridiculous in front of everyone. But Amara wasn't about to let that happen. With an almost imperceptible shift, she straightened in her seat, her posture commanding and unyielding. "I said return it," she repeated, her tone colder this time, laced with the kind of authority that could not be ignored. Chloe, still standing nearby, seemed to come to life. "Captain," she ventured cautiously. "Oh, maybe I can handle this? I can verify her details with the gate agents." Her voice was tentative, but it held a thread of something, perhaps an apology, or perhaps it was the recognition that something far larger than a simple dispute had just unfurled. Callahan whipped his head around at the flight attendant, his eyes flashing with unmasked anger. "Stay out of this, Chloe," he barked. "I'm the captain of this ship. I'm responsible for security." He turned back to Amara with a look of finality. "I won't have my authority questioned. Not by you, not by anyone." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, allowing her presence to fill the space between them. There was a deep, profound stillness in her eyes, like the calm before a storm, and yet, in that stillness, Callahan could feel the weight of a storm that had already arrived. With a flash of realization, he felt the shifting of power. His hand trembled slightly, and he hesitated just long enough for her to see it, just long enough for her to know that he was no longer sure. And in that moment, Amara Carter made a decision. "Captain Callahan," she said, her voice low but steel sharp, "I'm going to give you one final opportunity to return my property." Her gaze held his unyielding. "If you do not, you will be making the single greatest mistake of your career." His smirk faltered for just a second before it returned, weaker, more unsure. He was done for. But he didn't know it yet. Callahan stood there, frozen in place, staring at Amara as though she had just struck him with something invisible. The words she had spoken, "the greatest mistake of your career," had not yet fully landed in his mind. He wasn't sure what to do, whether to double down on his pride or back away from the mess he'd made. His gaze flickered, almost like a leaf caught in a windstorm, unsure of which direction to bend. Amara didn't let him make the decision for her. The air between them was thick with the tension of something about to break. He was a man who had lived his life in a cocoon of control, of authority. And here she was, showing him that the walls of his world were as fragile as anything else. His fingers, still clenched around her torn ID, trembled ever so slightly, the plastic bending under his grip. She saw it, the shift, the cracks. He was no longer in command of the situation. His small acts of dominance, the mocking laughter, the deliberate slow tearing of her identification, each one had been an attempt to strip her of her dignity, to remind her of her place in a world he saw as belonging to people like him. Older, white, male, and powerful. But the world wasn't so simple. Amara Carter wasn't any of those things. And in this moment it was clear, neither was he. "Captain," she said again, her voice soft but unwavering. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. "Return my identification, or I'll take it back." He looked at her, then down at the torn fragments of her license resting in his hand. His mind, a whirlwind of confusion, tried to gather the thoughts that were slipping through his fingers like water. He had never been forced to confront his own prejudice, to face the deep, underlying biases that had lived comfortably beneath the surface of his career. He'd been a decorated officer, a pilot with decades of service. People respected him, people obeyed him. But this woman, this young black woman, who refused to shrink, was breaking him down in ways he had never imagined. Callahan's pride warred with his fear, and in the battle his ego was beginning to lose. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out the way he wanted. They didn't come out with authority, they came out instead as a whisper of desperation. "I don't think—" His voice trailed off, faltering, weak. He wasn't speaking to her anymore. He was speaking to himself, searching for a way to make this right, to undo the knot he had tied around his own neck. He didn't know it, but it was too late. Amara, watching this silent unraveling, stood up from her seat. There was no rush in her movements, no aggressive flare. It was a calm, deliberate rise, one that made her appear taller, somehow more formidable. The space between them grew thin. There was no longer room for misunderstandings, no longer room for Callahan's feigned authority. "I'll take it back myself," she said, her voice steady and unflinching. She reached for the torn pieces of her ID, her fingers brushing against his crow. And for the briefest moment their hands touched. It was electric, a shock that didn't come from any outward force, but from the sheer weight of the moment. For a fleeting second, Callahan's eyes met hers, vulnerable, uncertain. In that second, she saw the man behind the uniform. He was a man who had spent so long at the top, so long believing that the world owed him, that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. He had used his power to shield himself from discomfort, from facing the parts of himself that were not so easily polished with a medal or a uniform. But now he had to face them, and Amara Carter was going to make sure he did. She took the license from his hand, her grip strong and unwavering. She could feel his hesitation, his reluctance to let go of the small bit of control he still clung to. But she wasn't angry, she wasn't frustrated, she was calm. And in that calm, there was a power that no man in a uniform could ever take away. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her tone almost polite, but with a weight that made the words feel like a reprimand. She watched as he stepped back, as the space between them widened. His eyes were still locked on hers, still searching, still struggling to understand what had just happened. He didn't say anything as she turned back to her seat, as she calmly slid her driver's license back into her wallet. There was no smug smile, no last word, no victory lap. The moment was over. She had won, but the victory wasn't in the license. The victory was in the quiet, resolute way she had stood her ground. As she sat down, the weight of the cabin settled back into place. The passengers who had been watching the scene unfold turned away, their conversations resuming in soft murmurs, as if nothing had happened. But they knew they had seen something shift, something crack, and they couldn't unsee it. Chloe, the young flight attendant, was standing at the front of the cabin, her back pressed against the wall, her hands clasped in front of her. She had witnessed it all, the tension, the escalation, the power struggle. Her breath was slow, deliberate. She hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected any of it. But there it was, the aftermath of a confrontation between two people, one who had sought to assert control, and one who refused to relinquish hers. Amara glanced at Chloe, her eyes softening just slightly. The young woman had been caught in the crossfire, had been a witness to something far bigger than a mere flight altercation. "Are you all right?" Amara asked, her voice gentle but sincere. Chloe nodded quickly, her lips trembling. I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "You did fine," Amara replied, giving her a small, reassuring smile. You just stayed out of it, and that's all you needed to do." Amara turned her gaze forward, resting her eyes on the view outside the window. The city lights of New York were barely visible now, the plane cutting through the night sky as it climbed higher. She could feel the hum of the engine, the steady pulse of the flight. She could feel herself finally starting to relax, as though the storm that had raged just moments before had passed over her without a trace. But Captain Callahan hadn't made it through the storm unscathed. As the minutes ticked by, Amara knew that he was still up there in the cockpit, trying to reconcile the man he thought he was with the man who had just been exposed for all to see. The flight continued, and the soft hum of the engines, the gentle sway of the aircraft, and the occasional clink of a champagne flute were all that could be heard now. Yet there was a new heaviness in the air, a weight that hadn't been there before. The passengers had settled back into their seats, but their minds were still working, still processing what they had just witnessed. Callahan, on the other hand, was not so calm. His mind raced, each thought more frantic than the last. He had been humiliated, stripped of the little power he had clung to in this confined space. His authority, the very thing that had defined him for so long, had been shattered in a matter of seconds. The moments on the plane felt like hours to him, each tick of the clock pushing him further into a state of panic. He could still hear Amara's voice in his mind, as clear as it had been when she had spoken to him. "You made the single greatest mistake of your career." What had he done? He couldn't stop asking himself that question. He had thought he was in control. He had thought he could do whatever he wanted, that no one would question him. But now, as he sat in the cockpit with his back pressed against the seat, he realized he had been the one who had been tested, and he had failed. There was a strange sensation in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing feeling that refused to go away. It wasn't just the fear of being caught. No, it was something deeper, something far more troubling. He had taken a woman's identification, torn it up, and humiliated her in front of the entire cabin. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because of who she was. Amara, Dr. Amara Carter. He hadn't seen her as a threat. He had seen her as something beneath him, something he could push around. He had assumed that her silence was weakness, her calm demeanor ignorance. And now, as the plane cruised through the dark sky, he realized how terribly wrong he had been. She was nothing like the woman he had imagined. She wasn't some pampered passenger, some naive girl who had somehow slipped into first class. She was a force that had stood in front of him, calm and unyielding, and shown him just how fragile his own power really was. His mind began to play out the events again, his thoughts cycling through the moments in quick flashes. The way she had remained so poised when he tore her ID, the way she had stayed calm when he tried to provoke her. How she had effortlessly taken control of the situation without raising her voice, without resorting to anger or fear. She had just stood. She had stood in the face of everything he had thrown at her, and it was he who had buckled. Callahan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The anger surged again, hot and bitter. How dare she? How dare she make him look like a fool? But even as the rage rose within him, another quieter voice began to make itself heard. A voice he didn't want to listen to, a voice that told him he had been the fool. He had seen his own arrogance, his own prejudice, come to life in that moment. And the realization of it was more suffocating than any punishment. But there would be no escape from this. There would be no smooth landing back into the comfortable world of his cockpit, where passengers bowed to his commands and the rules of the sky had always bent to his will. No, this was different. This time there was something else waiting for him, something that wasn't in his control. The consequences of his actions were already in motion, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Amara, for her part, didn't look back. She didn't feel the need to. She had already moved beyond this. The moment had passed, she had stood her ground, and now she simply had to do her job. The mission in London was still waiting, still demanding her attention. There would be no more time for distractions, no time to dwell on what had happened back in the cabin. Her mind returned to the task at hand, as it always did. She had learned long ago that nothing was more dangerous than letting the past cloud your judgment. And what had happened on this plane wasn't about her. It was about him. It was about Captain Richard Callahan and the way he had let his own biases, his own prejudices, control him. The tragedy wasn't in what he had done to her. It was in what he had done to himself. He had squandered his career, his respect, his future, over nothing more than his own inability to see beyond his narrow view of the world. The cabin, still reverberating with the echoes of their confrontation, slowly began to settle once again. The passengers resumed their quiet conversations, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the cockpit door. But none of them knew what had truly taken place in that brief, intense moment. They could sense the shift, the break in the atmosphere, but they couldn't name it. They didn't have to. They had witnessed something far more profound than the simple clash of two personalities. They had witnessed a moment of reckoning, a moment in which one man, full of pride, had been shown just how easily the world could pull the rug out from under him. And the woman who had stood before him, calm and steady, had shown them all something else. She had shown them what it meant to stand. Callahan's mind wasn't finished, though. His thoughts were still scattered, still locked in that loop of self-loathing and justification. He had thought of himself as unbreakable, impervious to challenge, but Amara had broken him slowly, methodically, and he had no idea what was coming next. The plane leveled out, the engines humming with the steady rhythm of flight. Somewhere beneath them the city lights of New York had disappeared, swallowed by the vast expanse of the ocean below. Callahan turned his head, glancing toward the company pilot. The younger man, David Morrison, was sitting quietly, his hands firmly on the controls. David didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had been watching the whole thing unfold, and he knew what had just happened. The captain, the man he had once looked up to, had just been taken down, not by any external force, but by his own failure to see the truth in front of him. It wasn't a moment of glory for anyone. It wasn't about victory or defeat. It was just a reckoning. A moment when the man who thought he could control everything was finally forced to face the truth that nothing is as permanent as we think it is. The minutes stretched on, thick and heavy in the quiet cockpit. Captain Callahan had fallen into a deep, brooding silence. His hands rested uselessly on the armrests of his seat. His knuckles white with the strain of not gripping anything. Every so often his eyes would flicker toward the flight instruments. But they were distant, unfocused. The autopilot was guiding them now. He no longer had the clarity to steer. Every passing second felt like a small death, an irreversible reminder of what he had done and who he had become. His mind churned, going over the events like a bad replay that wouldn't stop running. David Morrison, the first officer, sat to his right, eyes fixed ahead. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to give his captain the words of comfort that Callahan so desperately wanted. David knew the man who had sat next to him for years. He had respected him, even admired him at times. But now he could only feel a cold distance between them, a void that no words could fill. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. This was about truth. David had watched Callahan's descent not just on the flight, but in the years leading up to this moment. He had seen the arrogance build, seen the way the captain treated people like mere props, as if they existed only to reinforce the structure of his own inflated self-worth. He'd watched Callahan manipulate situations for his benefit, pushing boundaries, bending rules, even playing fast and loose with protocol. It was a slow build-up, but now it was all crashing down in real time. David couldn't help but feel pity. He had never been one for confrontation, never one to rock the boat. He had always been the one who sat quietly, who did his job and stayed out of the way. But now, as Callahan shrank into the seat next to him, David knew something had fundamentally shifted between them. It wasn't just a power struggle. It was a loss of faith, a breaking of the illusion that Callahan had been able to sustain for so long. The man who had once carried himself with such unshakable confidence was now just a shell of that persona. David could see it, clear as day. He could see it in the way Callahan's shoulders slumped, the way his eyes avoided direct contact. He could see it in the way he had crumbled the second Amara Carter had stood her ground. The rest of the flight was a muted blur. The passengers, who had once been tense, had slowly settled back into their routines. The murmurs in the cabin had died down, replaced by the soft clinking of silverware and the occasional whisper of flight attendants moving quietly through the aisles. No one mentioned what had just transpired, no one spoke of it, but everyone felt it. There was a collective understanding in the air, a weight that hadn't been there before. The passengers might not have understood the full scope of what had happened. No, but they knew one thing. They had witnessed something they would not soon forget. And for Amara Carter, that was all that mattered. She sat in her seat, her hands resting calmly on her lap, as if she had not just torn through the fabric of an old man's identity. But in truth, she wasn't thinking about Callahan anymore. She wasn't thinking about what had happened back there, at the front of the plane, when the entire cabin had held its breath. No, her mind was already moving forward. The mission she was on was too important for her to be distracted by a petty encounter. She had seen this kind of thing before, men like Callahan who assumed that because of their uniforms, their positions, they had the right to diminish others. But the reality was simpler than that. Their power was always an illusion. And Amara, with her quiet strength, had reminded him of that, reminded them all. Her thoughts drifted to the case she had left behind in New York. The terrorist financier, the one she had brought in just hours before the flight. He had thought he was untouchable. She had proven him wrong. Now, she was on her way to London to meet with M.I. Woove, to pass along intelligence that would crack open a web of international terror. The people she was working with, the ones who had placed their trust in her, depended on her. That was where her focus had to remain. The flight attendants, including Chloe, continued their rounds, but their movements were a little more cautious. Now, a little slower, as if the residual tension of the previous altercation had not quite left the cabin. Chloe's face, still pale, kept glancing toward Amara, but Amara's eyes were always trained ahead, always focused. She could sense the young woman's discomfort, but she didn't blame her. Chloe had been witness to a power struggle she hadn't been prepared for. A clash between two worlds, and she had been caught in the middle of it. The world of the unshakable authority that Callahan had embodied, and the world of the unseen, steady strength that Amara Carter had quietly represented, and yet in the end only one of those worlds had survived, only one of them had remained unbroken. Amara shifted in her seat, pulling out her phone and checking her encrypted messages. There were updates from the team on the ground in London, and she read them quickly, processing the information. The mission was on schedule. The information she had gathered was already making waves across the intelligence community. She could feel the weight of her work settling back onto her shoulders. This was what mattered. Not the small moment of humiliation she had just inflicted on Callahan. Not the drama of that encounter, but the larger picture. The lives that depended on her success, the people who needed to be protected. And yet, even as her mind returned to the task at hand, I know, she couldn't help but feel a small, quiet satisfaction. The same satisfaction that had washed over her the moment she had stood up to Callahan. It wasn't a victory. No, it wasn't that simple. It was just justice, meted out in a way that only someone like Amara Carter could deliver. Her hands, which had always been steady, always been in control, had guided her through that moment. The anger had never surfaced, nor had the need for any dramatic confrontation. It had been pure strength, pure power, wielded with the calm precision of someone who understood that real authority doesn't come from shouting, from dominating. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. And no one, least of all a man like Callahan, could ever take that away. As the plane continued its journey toward London, Amara Carter was already preparing for what awaited her on the ground. She had no time for distractions, no time for reflection. There was work to be done, and she was the one who would do it. In the cockpit, Callahan remained silent. His thoughts, if he could call them that, were still wrapped in a haze of confusion. He had been a man used to control, used to asserting his dominance over others, keeping people in their place. But now, here he was, with nothing left. The bitter truth was sinking in, the realization that he had lost not just his authority, but his identity. The man who had once flown high in the skies was now grounded, his wings clipped by his own arrogance. The landing in London would be the end of his flight, metaphorically and literally. He had no idea yet what was waiting for him on the ground. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the same. Nothing would be the same again. The flight began its descent into London, the cabin noticeably quieter now, as though the weight of the past few hours had settled over everyone like a thick fog. The passengers had been drawn into the undercurrent of tension, and now, as the plane approached Heathrow, they were all holding their breath. They didn't know exactly what had happened between Callahan and Amara, but they knew it was something they would remember. Some of them had even caught glimpses of the tension in the cockpit when the first officer, David, glanced nervously at his captain. But no one spoke about it, not yet, not here. Callahan hadn't spoken a word since his last humiliating exchange with Amara. His eyes were glassy, distant, and for a man who had spent his career in the command seat of a jet, controlling the skies and his surroundings with supreme confidence. So this was something he had never experienced. Not like this. His hands, once firm on the controls, now lay limply at his sides, as if he had forgotten what it meant to have control over anything. David Morrison, the first officer, felt the weight of his captain's silence. He had always respected Callahan. Hell, he had looked up to the man when he first started flying. But now, as he sat in the cockpit next to the broken shell of the man he had once admired, the respect had turned to pity. It wasn't the kind of pity that he felt comfortable with, though. It wasn't just about feeling sorry for someone. It was the pity of seeing someone's dignity crumble before your eyes. It was the kind of pity that made you wonder how the hell you got caught up in someone else's downfall. The radio crackled with the voice of air traffic control, breaking through the heavy silence. Ora Chibite Isherwool, you are cleared for final approach to Heathrow. Please confirm landing gear down and locked. David's voice came in steady, professional. "Roger, Heathrow. Landing gear down and locked. Preparing for final approach." It was a routine exchange, but for David the words felt like they were coming from someone else. This wasn't routine. It wasn't just another flight. It was a final reckoning, a moment when everything Callahan had built was about to come crashing down. As the plane glided lower toward the runway, the hum of the engines sounded almost foreign, as though even the machinery could sense the shift in the air. Callahan's grip on the controls was barely there, as if his hands had forgotten their purpose. He had always been in command, always the one who made the decisions. But now, as they descended into the heart of London, the reality was sinking in. He had no control over what was coming next. This wasn't just another landing. This was the beginning of the end. In the first-class cabin, Amara sat with the same quiet composure that had carried her through the entire flight. The world outside the window was a blur of city lights and soft clouds. But inside, her mind was already on the next phase of her mission. She wasn't here for drama. She wasn't here for personal vendettas. She was here to do a job, to get the information she needed into the right hands, and to make sure the dangerous man she had helped capture never saw the light of day again. Her mind was sharp, cutting through the noise and distractions like a blade. She couldn't afford to let anything, not even the little power games of men like Callahan, derail her focus. Still, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not because she had won. No, she didn't see it as winning. It was more like justice. What had happened on the plane wasn't about power. It was about the truth of who she was and who Callahan was. And in that moment, the truth had been laid bare for all to see. He had tried to break her. He had tried to make her smaller, insignificant, just another woman of color who didn't belong in places like first class. But she had shown him that the things people try to use against you, whether it's your age, your gender, or your skin, are just tools in their hands. Tools you can turn right back around if you know how. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the familiar jolt of landing snapped Amara from her thoughts. The wheels screeched against the runway as they came to a smooth halt, and the low hum of the engines died down. The flight attendants began moving again, this time with the kind of hurried energy that spoke of something more than just the end of a flight. They were still on edge, still rattled by what had just happened. The passengers, too, seemed to sense it. There was an electric pulse of unease in the air as they began to gather their belongings. The feeling in the cabin was different now. It was no longer just the end of a flight. It was the end of something else, something bigger, something more permanent. They had seen what happened when power met someone who refused to be intimidated by it. They had seen a man of authority brought low, and they couldn't help but feel the echo of that moment. It wasn't a pleasant feeling. It wasn't even something they could name. But they all felt it, and they couldn't unfeel it. Amara stood up from her seat with the same fluid grace she had carried herself with the entire flight. She didn't look back at Callahan. She didn't need to. Her job here was done. She had taken her stand. Now, it was time for the real work to begin. The cabin door opened, and the cool London air rushed in, fresh and sharp. It was a brief, welcoming breath before the business of the day took over. As Amara made her way toward the jet bridge, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her. Some were curious, some were still processing what had happened, but none of them knew the whole story. Each of them knew what had led to this moment. But one thing was certain. Amara Carter was someone to be reckoned with. As she walked off the plane and into the waiting world of Heathrow, she was met by a member of the FBI's legal attaché team. a tall man in a suit who nodded to her in recognition. He didn't speak to her immediately. He didn't need to. The silent acknowledgment between them spoke volumes. She was here, and she had brought the storm with her. Callahan was still on the plane, still trapped in his own silence, still trapped by the events of the past hours. And when the ground crew came to guide him off the plane, the air was thick with the weight of what had already been set into motion. This was no longer about the comfort of the cockpit or the security of his badge. This was about the reckoning that had been brewing for far too long. In the end, Richard Callahan wasn't just defeated, he was exposed. And as he was escorted off the plane, his shoulders hunched, his mind scrambled with thoughts of survival. It became clear that the man he had once been was no more. He was simply a man broken by his own arrogance, his own prejudice. For Amara, the journey wasn't over. The mission continued, and she was already thinking about the next step, the next phase, the next person to stop, the next case to solve. And as she stepped forward, unbothered by the chaos she had just left behind, she knew one thing for sure. This was what power really looked like. The air at Heathrow was crisp, carrying with it the familiar hum of international travel, the quick shuffle of luggage, the steady murmur of hurried voices, the constant thrum of life moving forward. But to Amara, it all felt distant, like the world had paused just long enough to take a breath. And now, it was starting to pick up speed again, rushing toward whatever came next. She barely noticed the busy terminals, the towering skyscrapers in the distance, or the throngs of travelers walking in and out of the airport like ants in a line. Her focus was razor-sharp, directed solely on the task at hand. There was no room for distractions, not when the stakes were so high. Her thoughts flickered briefly to Callahan, still on the plane, still trapped in the quiet chaos of his own unraveling. She knew what would come next for him. His world had already started to collapse, the very fabric of his identity beginning to disintegrate. But Amara didn't have time to think about that now. There was always someone else waiting, always another battle to fight. The legal attaché, Mark, who had been waiting just inside the terminal, nodded at her as she approached. There was no need for formalities, no need for small talk. They had both been in this business too long to waste time on pleasantries. He gestured toward the small meeting room off to the side, a quiet space away from the chaos of the airport. As they walked down the sterile hallway, Amara could feel the weight of the world shift back onto her shoulders. The mission was back in full focus now. The intelligence she had gathered, bits and pieces of a much larger puzzle, was about to be passed on to MI. They had their work cut out for them. Terrorism, money laundering, and the connections she had uncovered were all part of a much larger, much darker web that spanned the network she was about to dismantle was dangerous, far more dangerous than any confrontation with a petty tyrant in a cockpit. She pushed the thoughts of Callahan out of her mind. There was no time for that kind of distraction, no time for sympathy. In her world, it was simple. You either got the job done or you didn't. And the job wasn't finished yet. Mark opened the door to the meeting room, a small, plain space with little more than a table, a few chairs, and a projector. The MI agents were already there, standing around the table, looking through the files she had sent ahead. Their faces were unreadable, but Amara could tell they were all business. They didn't need to waste time with introductions either, Dr. Carter, one of them said. Her voice clipped, precise. We've reviewed the information you sent over, but we need more. We need connections, names, dates, accounts. What have you got? Amara set her bag down, her fingers already working to unzip it and retrieve the files. I've got everything you need, she said, her voice calm, steady, But we need to move fast. The people I'm investigating are always one step ahead. If we don't act quickly, the entire operation could fall apart." The agents nodded, their faces tightening in concentration. The stakes were clear. They all knew that this wasn't just about stopping a few criminals. This was about stopping something much bigger. The kind of thing that could shake the foundations of their countries and others to their core. She began laying out the information, speaking as she did. "This is the financier I caught. He's been funneling money into extremist groups, but it's deeper than that. The real connections are international, and if we don't act fast, these people will be able to slip through the cracks again." As she spoke, the agents began taking notes, some nodding, some murmuring under their breath. Amara could feel the heat of their attention, the weight of their expectations, but it didn't faze her. She had been doing this for too long to feel nervous. This was just another piece of the puzzle, another step in the long road toward justice. The briefing continued for hours. Names were crossed off, others were added. The map of connections grew clearer. There was no rest, no break. They pushed through until the last bit of information had been digested, until the final piece had been put in place. By the time it was over, the agents were already moving, already preparing for the next step. The room was full of quiet energy, a focused intensity that Amara knew well. But even as they got to work, she could feel the exhaustion creeping in. It wasn't just the hours or the weight of the investigation. It was the long, unspoken cost of this life, the people she had lost along the way, the things she had sacrificed. But there was no time for that now, no time for self-pity. She was good at pushing those feelings down, hiding them where they wouldn't get in the way. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, they broke through. She stood up, collecting her things. As she did, Mark came up to her. "Thanks," he said simply. "This information, it's invaluable. We couldn't have done this without you." Amara nodded but didn't say anything. She didn't need the praise. The job wasn't over. There was still work to be done. She had already made her next move in her mind, already begun plotting the course to bring down the rest of the network. It would take time, it would take precision, but it would be done. As she turned to leave the room, Mark's voice stopped her. "You handled that well, back on the plane." "Callahan, he's not going to recover from that." Amara's steps faltered for a fraction of a second. "But only for a second. That's not my concern," she said, her voice neutral. "My concern is making sure the people I'm investigating can't hurt anyone else." She left the room, the door closing softly behind her, and stepped back into the bustle of the airport. There was no relief, there was no sense of completion, just the steady forward motion of a job that never ended, of a fight that never stopped. And as Amara Carter walked through the terminal, the life she had left behind, her past, her own struggles, her personal battles, was nothing more than a distant echo. The woman who had stood in the face of authority on a plane, who had held her ground and made the world take notice, was not the woman walking through Heathrow now. No, that woman had already moved on. She was already thinking about the next piece of the puzzle, the next person she had to stop, the next threat she had to dismantle. She had no time to dwell on anything else. The work was all that mattered. And for Amara Carter, the work was just beginning. The flight began its descent into London, the cabin noticeably quieter now, as though the weight of the past few hours had settled over everyone like a thick fog. The passengers had been drawn into the undercurrent of tension, and now, as the plane approached Heathrow, they were all holding their breath. They didn't know exactly what had happened between Callahan and Amara, but they knew it was something they would remember. Some of them had even caught glimpses of the tension in the cockpit when the first officer, David, glanced nervously at his captain. But no one spoke about it, not yet, not here. Callahan hadn't spoken a word since his last humiliating exchange with Amara. His eyes were glassy, distant, and for a man who had spent his career in the command seat of a jet, controlling the skies and his surroundings with supreme confidence. This was something he had never experienced. Not like this. His hands, once firm on the controls, now lay limply at his sides, as if he had forgotten what it meant to have control over anything. David Morrison, the first officer, felt the weight of his captain's silence. He had always respected Callahan. Hell, he had looked up to the man when he first started flying. But now, as he sat in the cockpit next to the broken shell of the man he had once admired, the respect had turned to pity. It wasn't the kind of pity that he felt comfortable with, though. It wasn't just about feeling sorry for someone. It was the pity of seeing someone's dignity crumble before your eyes. It was the kind of pity that made you wonder how the hell you got caught up in someone else's downfall. The radio crackled with the voice of air traffic control, breaking through the heavy silence. Ora Chibite Isherwool, you are cleared for final approach to Heathrow. Please confirm landing gear down and locked. David's voice came in steady, professional. Roger, Heathrow. Landing gear down and locked. Preparing for final approach. It was a routine exchange, but for David the words felt like they were coming from someone else. This wasn't routine. It wasn't just another flight. It was a final reckoning, a moment when everything Callahan had built was about to come crashing down. As the plane glided lower toward the runway, the hum of the engines sounded almost foreign, as though even the machinery could sense the shift in the air. Callahan's grip on the controls was barely there, as if his hands had forgotten their purpose. He had always been in command, always the one who made the decisions. But now, as they descended into the heart of London, the reality was sinking in. He had no control over what was coming next. This wasn't just another landing. This was the beginning of the end. In the first-class cabin, Amara sat with the same quiet composure that had carried her through the entire flight. The world outside the window was a blur of city lights and soft clouds. But inside, her mind was already on the next phase of her mission. She wasn't here for drama. She wasn't here for personal vendettas. She was here to do a job, to get the information she needed into the right hands, and to make sure the dangerous man she had helped capture never saw the light of day again. Her mind was sharp, cutting through the noise and distractions like a blade. She couldn't afford to let anything, not even the little power games of men like Callahan, derail her focus. Still, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not because she had won. No, she didn't see it as winning. It was more like justice. What had happened on the plane wasn't about power. It was about the truth of who she was and who Callahan was. And in that moment, the truth had been laid bare for all to see. He had tried to break her. He had tried to make her smaller, insignificant, just another woman of color who didn't belong in places like first class. But she had shown him that the things people try to use against you, whether it's your age, your gender, or your skin, are just tools in their hands. Tools you can turn right back around if you know how. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the familiar jolt of landing snapped Amara from her thoughts. The wheels screeched against the runway as they came to a smooth halt, and the low hum of the engines died down. The flight attendants began moving again, this time with the kind of hurried energy that spoke of something more than just the end of a flight. They were still on edge, still rattled by what had just happened. The passengers, too, seemed to sense it. There was an electric pulse of unease in the air as they began to gather their belongings. The feeling in the cabin was different now. It was no longer just the end of a flight. It was the end of something else, something bigger, something more permanent. They had seen what happened when power met someone who refused to be intimidated by it. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud. And don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.